For most people today, the Middle Ages feel like a distant world of castles, plagues, knights, and superstition. But hidden behind those stone walls was something far more unsettling. A world where sexuality wasn't private, wasn't personal, and wasn't even fully yours. It was controlled, inspected, judged, and sometimes weaponized. And the rules weren't just strict. They were bizarre, invasive, and deeply disturbing. Imagine living in a society where a simple kiss could be labeled a sin, where desires were watched like crimes, and where the church believed they had the right to decide when you could touch your spouse, how you could touch them, and even what days of the year your body belonged to God instead of your partner. For many medieval people, sexuality wasn't something natural. It was something dangerous. The fear of desire was everywhere. Priests warned people that passion was a gateway for demons to enter the home. Women were taught that their bodies were temptation traps, sent to test the purity of men. And men were told that uncontrolled lust would bring curses, illness, and shame upon their families. In a world without scientific understanding, sexuality became a battlefield of superstition. But it didn't stop at preaching. The church created rulebooks, thick manuals written by priests obsessed with listing every possible sinful act. And they meant every act. Some documents described sexual behaviors in such graphic detail that modern historians admitted they were shocked. These books were not written for education, they were written for control. And control was the point. Because in the Middle Ages, desire wasn't viewed as a personal feeling. It was treated as a force that could destroy society. A married couple who acted with too much passion were considered spiritually weak. A woman who enjoyed intimacy too much was labeled dangerous. A man who wanted it too often was said to be possessed. Shame was everywhere. Privacy didn't exist. But the most unsettling part? The church didn't just create rules for the bedroom, it created punishments. Break the rules, and you might be forced into weeks of fasting, days of prayer, or humiliating public confession. In some cases, couples were separated and ordered to sleep apart for months. And if that didn't work, the church claimed the right to intervene even deeper. This wasn't guidance, it was surveillance. It was only the beginning. Because as disturbing as these spiritual rules were, medieval society had far creepier practices waiting, from public bed inspections to humiliating virginity tests, to demon-based superstitions that controlled how people lived, married, and suffered. And the next part reveals one of the most shocking truths of all. People in the Middle Ages were forced to prove their marriage in public. Imagine this. You're newly married. The crowd outside your door is buzzing, and tonight, your first night together is not private, not romantic, not yours. Because in the Middle Ages, your wedding night belonged to the entire community. Most people today think wedding nights were sacred and personal, but for medieval couples, especially in Europe's villages and noble courts, the idea of privacy simply didn't exist. Marriage wasn't just a union of two people, it was a legal contract, a religious duty, and a public event. And because of this, everyone believed they had the right to make sure it was completed, and that meant one thing: public bed inspections. In many medieval towns, officials, sometimes priests, sometimes village elders, and sometimes entire groups of relatives escorted the couple into their chamber. Once inside, the newlyweds were expected to lie down in bed, fully clothed or half-clothed, while witnesses prayed over them, offered advice, or simply watched. Yes, watched. Some customs required witnesses to stay in the room, sitting silently in the corner as the couple tried to consummate their marriage. Others listened from behind a curtain. Others stood outside the door, waiting for signs. But the worst part: what happened after, when the couple finished, or were believed to have finished, officials often entered the room to inspect the sheets. They checked for physical evidence, mostly blood, which they believed proved a woman's virginity. If the sheet was clean, whispers began, rumors spread. Both the bride and groom were questioned the next day. Families blamed each other. Priests demanded confessions. The bride might be accused of impurity. The groom might be accused of impotence. Couples were sometimes forced to repeat the act again, with witnesses waiting outside. Royal couples had it even worse. In the courts of France, Spain, and England, dozens of nobles gathered outside the wedding chamber. Some even had the right to witness the couple being placed in the bed. The king or queen's fertility was so important that their bodies were treated like national property, inspected, discussed, and judged. For many brides, this was one of the most terrifying nights of their lives, not because of marriage, but because of the crowd waiting to decide their fate. And the pressure wasn't symbolic, it was real. If a marriage wasn't consummated, it could be annulled. Lands could be lost. Alliances could collapse. A woman's reputation could be destroyed in a single night. And sometimes, desperate families forced couples to perform in ways that today would be recognized as coercive and abusive. But as invasive as bed inspections were, they weren't the worst intrusion, because medieval society created something even more disturbing. Virginity tests, cruel, humiliating, and completely unscientific. Today, most people know that virginity tests are scientifically meaningless. But in the Middle Ages, they weren't just believed. They were treated as absolute truth, capable of deciding a woman's future. Her marriage, her reputation, and even her safety. And the most disturbing part? These tests were almost always wrong. The body became evidence. In medieval Europe, a woman's worth was often tied to her purity. Virginity wasn't simply a private matter, it was a family asset, a legal requirement, and a symbol of honor. A bride accused of impurity could be abandoned, punished, publicly shamed, or returned to her family like a defective item that needed inspection. To prove purity, midwives, or sometimes older women from the village, were called in to examine the bride's body. They checked for physical signs they believed indicated virginity. In their minds, the body was a crime scene, and they were investigators. Of course, none of these signs were real. None of them meant anything. But people believed they did. And that belief was powerful enough to destroy lives. The fake science behind it all. So what did medieval examiners look for? The tightness of certain muscles, the appearance of the hymen skin tone, posture, or expressions of innocence. Even how a girl walked or spoke, some examiners claimed they could tell by looking into a woman's eyes. Others said they could sense moral purity through touch. It was guesswork mixed with superstition, but it carried the weight of law. If a woman failed the test, the consequences were terrifying. A marriage could be canceled, a dowry could be denied. She could be labeled impure or sinful, her family could lose social standing, she could be sent away, punished, or forced into a convent. And for noble women, the stakes were even higher. One failed test could ruin political alliances, collapse military agreements, or even spark violence between rival families. But the darkest part: sometimes tests were used to cover up crimes committed against the woman herself. Victims of assault were judged by the same standards as if their trauma was proof of guilt, not suffering. The Middle Ages didn't just misunderstand women's bodies, they weaponized that ignorance. The nightmarish proof sheets virginity wasn't the only thing medieval society demanded proof of. After a wedding night, families, priests, or officials often examined the bed sheets. Blood was considered evidence of purity, even though medically it meant nothing. No blood meant accusations. Accusations meant shame. Shame meant punishment. The pressure placed on young women was enormous, cruel, and impossible to escape. But if virginity tests were based on fear, the next medieval belief was based on something even more disturbing. People believed desire itself could summon demons. And in the next part, you'll discover how sexuality and the supernatural became terrifyingly entangled in the medieval mind. For people in the Middle Ages, desire wasn't just a human feeling. It was a spiritual threat, something dangerous. Something that could open the door to forces beyond human control. And that fear created some of the most chilling beliefs in medieval history. Because in a world without science, people didn't blame hormones. They blamed demons. Incubi and succubi, the night visitors. Medieval men claimed they were attacked in their sleep by seductive female demons called succubi, who came to steal their strength. Women reported being visited by incubi, male demons who forced themselves upon them. These stories weren't rare. They appeared in church writings, medical texts, and even court records. Doctors said the visits caused exhaustion, illness, infertility, emotional instability, sinful dreams. Priests claimed demons targeted people who had unchecked desire, especially those who struggled with lust. And so, ordinary people lived in fear of their own bodies, terrified that a single impure thought could invite a supernatural attack. Some families even hired priests to bless their beds, burn incense, sprinkle holy water around the house to protect their daughters from nightly seduction. It sounds unreal today, but for medieval people, it was as normal as going to the doctor. Magic, lust, and the blame on women. Women especially were blamed for causing desire. Many believed women possessed natural temptation powers, and some thought the womb itself had magical influence. Medieval folklore claimed women could trap men with enchanted belts or ribbons. Special herbs could make someone fall in love. Hair, sweat, or clothing could be used in love potions. Men could be rendered impotent through curses. And whenever a man struggled sexually, even if it was stress, illness, or age, he often blamed a woman for bewitching him. These accusations could lead to legal trials. Actual trials. In some cases, a man had to perform humiliating tests in front of officials to prove he was indeed cursed. If he failed, the woman could be punished, even with no evidence. Superstition didn't just shape sexuality, it controlled it. Demonic blame became a tool. These beliefs gave the church enormous power. If someone committed adultery, they could claim a demon tempted them. If a noble woman became pregnant out of wedlock, her family might say an incubus was responsible. It was superstition mixed with convenience, and it served those who wanted to avoid social shame. But while demon fear belonged to the spiritual world, medieval society also believed sexuality had physical effects on the body. And that led to one of the strangest and creepiest beliefs of all. Sex wasn't just desire, it was medicine. In the next part, we dive into the disturbing ways medieval doctors recommended sex as a cure, and the dark consequences that followed. Of all the strange beliefs that shaped medieval sexuality, few were as unsettling or as dangerous as the idea that sex was a medical treatment. In a time before modern science, doctors and philosophers relied on ancient theories about bodily humors, energy, and balance. And according to these beliefs, sexual activity wasn't just normal. It was medicine, capable of healing or harming depending on how it was used. This wasn't romantic, it wasn't loving. It was clinical, cold, and often cruel. Sex as a treatment for sadness, weakness, or even paralysis. Medieval doctors truly believed that the body required regular sexual release to stay healthy, especially for men. They wrote that seed needed to be expelled, or it would build up poisonous heat in the body. If a man experienced headaches, anxiety, muscle weakness, or melancholy, doctors sometimes recommended intercourse as a cure. Not with a partner of his choice, not even with his wife, just sex. As a prescription. These medical texts treated women not as patients, but as tools to restore male strength. Desire became a bodily function, like sweating or bleeding. The man needed it. The woman was simply part of the treatment, and the reverse belief was even stranger. Women were told to avoid desire entirely according to medieval medicine. Women's bodies were cold and moist, while men were hot and dry. That meant male desire was natural even, necessary, but female desire was dangerous. Doctors wrote that women who felt too much passion could become overheated, leading to madness, hysteria, disobedience, wandering womb syndrome. Yes. They believed the womb could move inside the body, so while men were encouraged to release desire, women were instructed to suppress it. A woman who enjoyed intimacy too much was considered morally weak. A woman who refused it was considered sick or cursed. This double standard shaped marriages for centuries. The creepiest belief of all: virgin healing. Some medieval physicians claimed that being with a virgin could restore a man's vitality, cure diseases, or extend life. This belief didn't just belong to peasants. It existed in certain royal courts and medical circles. It was dangerous, abusive, and completely unscientific. But powerful men used it as justification anyway. The idea turned young girls into healing objects, especially in elite societies. It encouraged exploitation while giving men a moral excuse. And because the Middle Ages mixed superstition with medicine, this kind of abuse wasn't just tolerated, it was written into medical manuals. Women became medical experiments if a woman suffered infertility. Doctors sometimes recommended humiliating rituals, strange herbal mixtures, or bizarre physical examinations. In some areas, women were told to expose themselves to male heat by sitting near fires, drinking special potions, or disturbingly interacting with certain men considered medically potent. The lack of understanding turned women's bodies into testing grounds. But as twisted as medieval medical beliefs were, they weren't the end of this dark story. Because behind all the rules, tests, superstitions, lay a deeper truth. Medieval sexuality wasn't just controlled, it was weaponized. And in the next part, we uncover how society used shame, fear, and punishment to enforce obedience in the most private part of life. The deeper you look into medieval sexuality, the more you realize something unsettling. Their laws weren't just strict, they were obsessed with control. And nowhere was that clearer than in the strange, disturbing punishments given to people accused of sexual sins. These punishments weren't only meant to correct behavior. They were meant to shame, humiliate, and permanently mark someone as impure. And the most terrifying part? Many of the accused had no way to defend themselves. One of the strangest punishments involved what the church called public penance rituals. Suppose a man and woman were caught together without marriage. The church wouldn't just scold them. Instead, they could be forced to stand barefoot outside the church wearing nothing but simple linen, holding candles, while the entire town walked past, staring, whispering, and sometimes even spitting. People didn't forget these moments. A single humiliation could destroy a person's reputation for life. But that wasn't the worst of it. For women accused of sexual misconducts, sometimes even rumors were enough. The punishment became far more terrifying. A woman might be marched through the village wearing a wooden yoke around her neck, the same tool used for farm animals. This wasn't symbolic, it was intentional. It told everyone, she is less than human. Some women were locked in cage-like structures, called cucking stools, and dunked into freezing rivers again and again. They weren't executed for sexual sin, but the humiliation alone could ruin marriages, families, or ability to find work. In a world where reputation meant survival, this was a social death sentence. Men, on the other hand, faced strange rituals too. Some were forced to walk in circles around the churchyard while villagers mocked them. Others were made to perform labor meant to strip them of dignity, cleaning latrines, sweeping muddy streets, or working in silence for days with shackles on their ankles. The shame was the real punishment. But the darkest part? The church didn't always need evidence. They relied on confession, and their preferred method of getting one was equally disturbing. Priests would ask shockingly intimate questions in confession booths, questions about fantasies, dreams, and private acts. This moral interrogation wasn't just spiritual guidance. It was surveillance. The church wanted to monitor not only what people did, but what they thought. One wrong answer, one rumor, one confession spoken under pressure, and someone could find themselves marked as impure forever. But what happened to the people who didn't fit into the strict categories the church allowed? The ones whose desires didn't match the laws, the ones who loved in ways society refused to understand. What happened to them is even darker. As the Middle Ages tightened its grip on morality, anyone who didn't fit neatly into the church, strict definition of acceptable desire, found themselves living in constant danger. Forbidden attraction wasn't just frowned upon, it was treated as a threat to the entire social order. And the punishments for it were far more brutal, secretive, and psychologically crushing than anything used for ordinary sins. The church believed that desire itself was something that had to be controlled, not just actions, thoughts. And this led to a disturbing obsession: identifying, exposing, and correcting people who experienced what the church called unnatural desires. These people included anyone whose love, attraction, or identity did not match church expectations. The result? Medieval society built a hidden system of fear. Many towns had what were called moral watchmen. They were citizens appointed to spy on neighbors, paying attention to who visited whom, who stayed out late, whose windows were lit past midnight. Their job was to report suspicious behavior to bishops and magistrates. Imagine living with the fear that anyone, a neighbor, a coworker, even a relative, could report your private life to the authorities. Once accused, things got even worse. Confession wasn't gentle or healing, it was interrogation. Priests would demand, "Who do you desire? What thoughts enter your mind? Have you ever been tempted?" These weren't questions meant to help someone. They were designed to trap them. A single wrong answer could be recorded as evidence, and once written in the church's books, it followed the person for life. But the darkest part came afterward, the punishments created to correct those who felt desire outside the church's limits. These punishments didn't focus on physical pain, they focused on psychological destruction. One method was called enforced solitude. Accused individuals, often young and confused, were locked into monastic cells for weeks or months. No visitors, no talking, just silence and darkness. The church believed that isolating someone with their thoughts would starve the sin. In reality, it broke people. As many came out emotionally shattered. Others were forced into purification rituals. This meant fasting, sleep deprivation, and long nights repeating prayers meant to cleanse the mind. Some were forbidden to look at anyone for days, forced to walk with lowered eyes or wear veils that blocked their vision. The message was clear: your desire makes you unworthy to look at others. And then there were the secret punishments quietly carried out so the town would never know. Young people caught in forbidden relationships might be separated by force, sent to different towns, or placed under church guardianship. Families could be ordered to watch them day and night. Some were even made to live in monasteries against their will, never allowed to marry or pursue a normal life.
Ow.
All of this happened not because these people harmed anyone, but because medieval society could not tolerate difference. But the story gets even darker. It's because, while ordinary people were punished for their desires, the most powerful men of the age, the nobility, wealthy clergy, and even kings were allowed to do things that would shock the world today. No one dared to punish them. As brutal as the church could be toward ordinary people, the Middle Ages hid an even more disturbing truth. The rules were never meant for the powerful. While common men and women were punished, shamed, isolated, or even imprisoned for immoral behavior, the elite lived by an entirely different code. Their desires weren't judged, they were protected. And the hypocrisy ran so deep that it shaped the entire moral system of the medieval world. Start with the nobility. Kings, dukes, and lords were expected to marry for politics, not for love. But once a nobleman married, everyone quietly accepted that he would take lovers. Not just once, sometimes dozens. Some kept entire households full of mistresses hidden behind castle walls. These women, often young and powerless, lived at the mercy of a man who could discard them at any moment. Yet the church said almost nothing. Why? Because nobles funded the church. They built cathedrals, donated land, and protected priests. So their sins were conveniently overlooked. Even worse were the clergy themselves. Priests, bishops, and monks were officially required to lead lives of pure chastity. In reality, medieval towns were full of whispered rumors about secret relationships behind monastery walls. Some monasteries even developed reputations for breaking the rules so often that the church had to send inspectors. But instead of punishing the offenders, the inspectors often took gifts, food, wine, money, and filed clean reports. Ordinary people saw this hypocrisy. They lived under harsh moral laws while watching the wealthy escape consequences with a simple donation. A noble could pay off a priest, sponsor a feast day, or promise land to a monastery. And suddenly his behavior was labeled a personal weakness instead of a sin. But the darkest part was indeed just the freedom the elite had was how they controlled the desires of the people around them. Noble households often kept young servants who had no power to refuse anything. A lord might demand companionship from a servant girl or punish her if she resisted. These acts weren't treated as crimes. They were considered the rights of the ruling class. If a servant became pregnant, the blame fell entirely on her. She might be dismissed, shamed, or forced to give up the child. The lord faced nothing, not even a warning. In some places, local laws even stated that a noble could not be accused by someone of lower status, meaning, if a servant tried to speak out, she could be punished for daring to challenge authority. The church called itself the guardian of morality, but behind closed doors, it served the powerful first and punished the powerless hardest. But one final layer of medieval sexuality remains the part that almost no one talks about. A system that mixed medicine, superstition, and fear into something truly unsettling. A system that shaped who people were allowed to love and how their bodies were treated. By the end of the Middle Ages, society had developed a twisted, fear-driven belief system about the human body, one that shaped everything from marriage to medicine. And while morality was enforced by priests and laws, the deepest fears came from something even older: superstition. Medieval people didn't just misunderstand sexuality, they misunderstood the body itself. Doctors of the era believed that the body was ruled by four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. They thought desire was caused by an imbalance of these fluids. If someone showed too much interest in intimacy, physicians might diagnose it as an excess of hot blood. The cure? Bloodletting, fasting, or purging. In other words, they drained people's bodies to control their desires. For women, the situation was even stranger. Medieval medicine claimed that women's bodies were unpredictable and dangerous. Doctors wrote that uncontrolled desire could make a woman's womb wander inside her body, causing suffocation, madness, or death. This bizarre idea led to treatments that today would be considered abusive. Women were forced to inhale pungent smoke, drink strange herbal mixtures, or sit in steam baths meant to calm the womb. Many fainted, some never recovered. Even worse was the belief in demonic influence. If someone acted differently, expressed forbidden attraction, or simply refused to marry, people whispered that they were being tempted by evil forces. Some towns hired wise women or healers to chase away spirits with chants or potions. Others sent people to priests who performed rituals meant to cleanse a person of desire. For many, these rituals were terrifying dark rooms. Long prayers, cold holy water poured over their heads, while priests demanded they drive the sin out. And then there was the fear of night spirits. Medieval communities believed that supernatural beings, incubi and succubi, visited people in their sleep, causing unwanted fantasies or desires. If someone admitted to having vivid dreams, priests might declare them afflicted. The treatment? More isolation? More fasting? It's more guilt. But perhaps the creepiest belief revolved around virginity. Medieval thinkers claimed a woman's honor lived in her body like a fragile glass container. If she wasn't a virgin on her wedding night, she could be shamed or punished. Yet the same men who demanded purity often broke the rules themselves. Medical charlatans sold fake virginity tests, while midwives were pressured to prove a bride's innocence. It was a system built on fear, control, and impossible standards. And through it all, sexuality remained something people were taught to fear, not understand. Desire was dangerous. Bodies were unpredictable. Ordinary people were stuck navigating a world where superstition mattered more than truth. This was the Middle Ages, a time when powerful institutions controlled lives. Punishments were cruel, and the human body itself was seen as a mystery filled with danger. A world where fear shaped everything, including who you loved, how you lived, and how you understood yourself.